big thing that I think can be said to be a part of his style is his use of violence.
Right.
I think that violence, you can't really talk about violence as just sort of one thing across movies, because of course, unless it's a really bad movie, in a lot of instances, it's not actually violence. It's the representation or the sort of mimicry or the pretendness of violence. And so it's another way to say that is that it's the work of an artist, right? So there's a style that you can begin to speak of in the way that violence is done. And maybe if you don't see a lot of violent films, you just sort of look at it all as one thing. But if you've seen as many horror films as I have, you begin to note, that there are distinctions to be made. And so I think that you can talk about Mel Gibson as having a sort of aesthetic of violence and having one that is his own. I think that when you watch a film like Braveheart, when you watch a film like Apocalypto, certainly when you watch The Passion, the violence it's not an accidental thing. It's definitely a part of it has to be taken as a part of the whole. And here, yeah, that's definitely the case. We're talking about a violent culture.
Right.
And so how that's depicted is going to be an important question that the artist has to address. And so we've already talked about how I think in general there is a commitment to realism. And so I think that there is a certain realism in the violence here, as there is in The Passion. That's one of the things that makes the film remarkable. So if I could say, like, for instance, there is the use of the blunt weapons in the scene when the city is being attacked, or the village is being attacked.
Yeah.
That's conveyed really, if not graphically, convincingly, through the sounds and through how we see the weapons being wielded. But it's also certainly very, very graphic as well. I think that there's it's an R-rated film.
Right.
But that isn't to say that it's gratuitous or excessive. So again, I think that he's there's a commitment to realism, but it's also it's also tasteful. So there, on the whole, I would say that it never really veers into a kind of like exhibitionist sort of wallowing in it.
The only part where I felt it might have been is when the nemesis of the main character finally gets killed.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the few places where it feels like it's like sort of lingering on it in a certain way. Maybe, I mean, it's definitely a kind of like a moment that's intended to sort of like wow you with the kind of the blood squirting out of the side of the guy's head.
Well, I mean, I think that you could say one that the commitment to realism is still there, right? So the spurting is of course happening from the blood that's being pumped from the heart. Right. And hearts, incidentally, are a pretty important part of this film, and the way that they function. We see beating hearts in hands, and all of that, just a quick aside, all of that has to be rendered very meticulously by an artist. Someone had to sculpt that model and then dress it with fake blood, and then also insert the mechanism that was going to make it to be able to beat, and be handled. And all of this stuff is very fascinating. And so you can't take any of it for granted. Is part of why I'm spending so much time talking about it, is that I think that things are communicated through the violence, and that Mel Gibson is a very outstanding example of this. And so what I was going to say in connection to this instance that you're talking about is that you can talk about the commitment to realism, but there's not just that, of course, right? This isn't just about realism. And so there is also a dramatic consideration. So, things are done for dramatic effect, as I think they are done here, because we're stretching out this moment, this final sort of victory of the culture of life over the culture of death. But then also there's a poetic significance. Now, I don't know if I have a sort of poetic interpretation of this moment, or specifically of the spurting there. But I do think that you can talk about a certain poetics of the violence in general. So some examples that come to mind are with one really interesting contrast is between the father, Zero Wolf, when he attends to this wound that his son has at this moment in the film. We don't even know that this is his son, because that hasn't been introduced, and he's really just treating him like any one of the other soldiers.
Right.
But he says, "Yeah, you forgot to duck." His son has a big swollen eye, and what does he do? He holds him, despite the fact that his son sort of pulls away in fear. He says, "No," he grabs him and bleeds the wound so that his son can see.
Yeah.
And so right there in that, we have communicated sort of the pragmatism of this people.
Right.
We have communicated the sort of the brutality, or the sort of the violence of the intervention. And then later, there's something to be said about this father-son relationship, because we realize, oh, that's his son,
Right.
But then very shortly after that, we get a scene of the mother stitching the wound of her 8-year-old son or something, using the heads of these ants.
Which is so crazy.
It is crazy. And also very graphic, because we get a close-in shot of the ants, biting into this wound.
Right.
Just as the slitting of the eye was very graphic too. I mean, and very amazingly rendered. Someone had to go in there with the whatever latex adhesive, and but I kind of dork out on this because I find the task so interesting. Like, what would it look like? But yeah, of course, with the mother and the son there, we have a very different picture of, how to use, how to make use of nature to heal, and also of her interaction with her son. It's very loving, it's very gentle, and the way that she deals with his fear, the way that she sort of encourages him to be brave in this moment, is very different from what we get from the father and the son there. So I'm going on for a long time here to say that that these moments are more than just like, oh, gross, look at that, like something is being conveyed.
Right.
The first violent thing we see is when they're divvying up the boar that they've been hunting. And so
it's tapir.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the first, heart that we see out in somebody's hand. But it's, it's an important sort of first introduction to, this is the world. This is the world that we live in. It's a bloody world. It's a violent world. But that isn't to say that it's necessarily a wicked one. We're going to see what wicked violence looks like. We're going to see how that's different,
Yeah.
And
Good point.
how Zero Wolf dies at the end. He's caught in a trap like an animal. He's tricked, he's killed using the exact same device that was used to hunt this tapir at the beginning.
Right.
And so his violence, his need for revenge, his dehumanization of other people, this culture of death that he represents, it makes him predictable and conquerable like an animal. And then also the way that it's not just in the way that the violence is rendered, so like in the magic trick of the effects itself, but it's also in the way that the camera is used, and sort of the relationship that the camera has to the violence. So a good example, I think, is during the human sacrifice sequence. you can think of a lot of different ways of filming that and of dealing with that. And some of them are going to be more brutal than others. And when I say brutal, I don't necessarily mean, again, explicit or gratuitous. That could be one way that you sort of do a really brutal rendition of this. And Mel Gibson doesn't shy away from showing it, but again, it's not like it's a spectacle and super gratuitous and like in your face.
Well, I did find myself surprised by how restrained he often was in many of the moments. I mean, there's a lot more violent moments that aren't handled as graphically than the ones that are handled graphically.
Well, but that's why I wanted to make another point about how violence is conveyed with the camera, and how brutality is sort of how the violence affects us.
Yeah.
So, in this moment, when the second person is brought up to be sacrificed, so we've already had the sort of establishing shot of the action itself. Now we see things a little bit more from the perspective of the person being sacrificed.
Right.
So we get a shot, a cut to his face as he sees his heart being held up in front of him. And that's a shot that we don't get with the first person who's sacrificed. And so
we also get a point of view shot from his head that's already been cut
yes,
off.
Yes, totally. But, there is some speculation about this, about the amount of time between a decapitation and your sort of loss of all consciousness, So there's like a real this point of view. The violence lands differently when it's being handled sensitively like this. When there are these cinematic gestures that are being given to us to sort of now identify us more with the victim.
Right.
And that's the same too with all the commitment to realism and to the sound effects and in a world where where we believe that the violence is realistic, that is going to change the effect that the violence has on us as spectators too, the way that it lands, Right. Even if, because at the end of the day, of course, it's not real. It's very stylized. That's all that it is. It's an elaborate magic trick, but the way that it's executed from one film to another is so different and speaks of so much artistic sensibility, that it really, it's a disservice to just sort of cavalierly dismiss it as so many like blood and guts. And so I think that if you look at Mel Gibson's films, in general, that you can sort of track this ability that he has to paint with these strokes of violence, and in so doing to really convey a lot.
If you get interrupted in a minute, is there any chance you'll be able to come back and do another 10 minutes or something?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
There's also quite a bit of, I think the term I've seen used is like ethnographic nudity in the film. Quite a bit maybe is too much of a too strong way of putting it. I would say it's fairly sensitively, fairly tastefully handled. It probably could have been handled with even a little bit more discretion than it was, because the women are generally wearing things, but they kind of like shift to the side and stuff. So it wouldn't have been unrealistic if he had just handled it in a way that we never saw any of the nudity. You know what I mean? Because it just wasn't shot from certain angles or whatever. But it's never exploitative. And that actually plays into some of the upsetting violent moments in the film as well, because when women are being hauled away on the way to the village, we're not seeing any, actual sexual acts or anything, but when a woman is being dragged away by her legs or whatever, and she is, topless, it's more upsetting. It's more visceral.
Right.
It plays into the, and they don't need to actually show anything more than that, for it to be very upsetting. And of course, we're also seeing the reaction of, the women's husbands who are seeing this, who are tied up or things like that. It's quite hard to watch.
Mm-hmm. But that's a good point. Yeah. Cause, There's a similar scene in one of the early Mad Max films, in terms of, you know, a kind of an explicit depiction of sexual assault,
Right.
and a similar topless actress, and that was like really wounding.
Well, it's an actual rape scene in that the
Right.
case of that film.
That's a good
Yeah.
distinction. But
Yeah.
even just the even if it the thing that I'm honing in on is sort of the use of nudity, because in that Mad Max example, that was like very wounding to me and my heart and my conscience.
Right.
But it didn't even occur to me the connection, you know, here in Apocalypto.
Right. Well, it's because they're already. It's
Right.
not that much of a change from the way that they're already dressed. Yes, they're,
Exactly,
you know,
exactly.
the clothing is going askew a little bit, but
Right. But the camera isn't really, it's not like a voyeuristic or a prurient
No.
thing, you know?
No.
Whereas in Mad Max,
I think in Mad Max he's literally looking through a telescope.
Right.
As this is happening.
Right. Exactly. So you know, yeah, like enough said, but another you know, interesting note about how the body is
Yeah.
employed, you know, in cinema.